Hi again, it's Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm. Today I'd like to take you through the different bloom forms of roses. If you've ever heard people use terms like high-centered or reflexed or buttoned and wondered what that means in terms of a flower of a rose, you're in luck. I've curated a bunch of pictures that I'm going to show you that I think clearly demonstrate these different bloom forms, moving from the simplest to the fanciest, and then maybe afterwards we'll take a walk around the garden and see if we can catch some examples in real life. When you think of the simplest bloom form, you might be looking at something with very few petals, like a wild rose. Oftentimes, you'll see that displayed as flat, almost all in one plane. Examples I can tell you of this are like Sally Holmes, the cluster flowering hybrid musk rose, or Mutabilis, a famous Chinese rose, or something like Altissimo, the climber. Now, of course, as you get more and more petals, it gets harder to maintain that flat form, moving up to something like La Belle Sultane, the Gallica rose. You can see it has more petals, but it's still maintaining that flat form pretty well. But by the time you move up to Tuscany Superb, the outer rim of petals is getting so thick that it's hard to call that flat at all. And for the remaining bloom forms that we're talking about, they usually, as you get more petals, you get more complexity in the bloom form. Moving to the next bloom form, let's talk about cupped bloom form. I'll show you the visual examples in this case of something like Belle Amour or Graham Thomas or the climber Eden in certain stages of its bloom. Remember that these are descriptive, not prescriptive, so you can't specifically say that a rose has this bloom form. It's meant to describe the bloom form at the stage that you see it. Now, the cupped bloom forms tend to be older and romantic. You'll see it on a lot of David Austin roses and old garden roses. It can have a lot of petals and be very full along the top, or it can be relatively open in the center as well. Some rose flowers, as they open, the edges of the petals will either curve back, roll back, or scroll back in the opposite direction, opening out and making a different form called reflexed. I'm going to give you some examples here of something like Gold Medal, the famous hybrid tea. Also very common in the miniature roses that you get that scrolled back. I'm going to give you the example here visually of Louis Desimero, and it can be very extreme on something that has a low petal count like Cecilbrunner Improved, the shrub. This can almost make a quilled or fluted look to the petals. One very famous rose bloom form you might be familiar with is called high-centered. This is the classic exhibition bloom form, and it's much more apparent on roses just as they're starting to open. They have a high center on the bud, and then they spiral outwards. And examples I'm going to give you on this are things like Gemini, or Veteran's Honor, or Mr. Lincoln. I'll show you all three of those in succession here. But the point on all of these is that they make that very attractive, almost florist rose look, and it's far more apparent in the early stages of opening. They can open out to something quite loose eventually, but in that early stage, this is the form they take. There is a traditional old bloom form that was not high-centered. It's called the rosette bloom form, at least officially. Oftentimes you'll see it listed in catalogs now as an old-fashioned bloom form, or peony-like, or quite full. And all it just means is it doesn't have that high center, it's a little flatter on the top, and it's full of petals in concentric circles all the way around. The examples I'm going to give you here visually are something like Gertrude Jekyll, or say Leonardo da Vinci, and you can see that they are so full of petals and they're arranged quite tightly, so you can't even see in general the stamens of the rose in this case. The next bloom form I'm going to talk about is quartered, and I'm going to give you the visual example of Sidonie right away because it's hard to describe without actually showing it. What it looks like is that all of the petals are packed in so tight that it starts to organize itself in the center of the rose into sort of four distinct sections that you'll be able to see here. It really happens when there are a lot of petals inside of that bloom. And so I'll give you some other examples here. Abraham Darby, I have a picture where it shows good quartering. Also Black Caviar and Duchess de Montebello. All of them have so many petals in the center that they start to organize themselves a little bit differently. I'll give a few seconds now to talk about buttoned roses because it's a fun bloom form that's connected to the quartered bloom forms. In this case, that extreme heaviness of petals in the center of the bloom actually almost pins them down to the center of the rose. The example I'm going to give you is Madame Hardy, which I've been showing you here. Also in a different picture of Duchess de Montebello, which we showed as quartered earlier, but here you can see it's clearly buttoned down. For me to describe the bloom form globular, you have to think it looks like a globe or a ball, and extreme examples of this would be things like Pompanella or La Reine Victoria or White Coster, which I'll show you the pictures of now. The fact is that this is quite closely related to the cupped bloom form, so something like Eden, which I would typically describe as cupped, can emerge globular at certain stages of its bloom form or would be described that way. And finally, we come to another variant called the scalloped or ruffled bloom form. Now, this is just something that has to do with the shape or wave in the petals. Famously, I'll show you Princess Alexandra of Kent, which has a very distinctive scalloped or ruffled edge. Also something like polka, so it's something you can kind of mix and match with the other bloom forms to add additional complexity. Since you were kind enough to stick through the lesson portion, let's walk around the garden a little bit and see if we can identify some of these ourselves. This is Fred Lode's, and if you're with me, you probably called this a flat bloom form. These two roses in the foreground here are the Reeve, and certainly because the petals are upwards and inward curving, I would call that cupped. Now cupped sometimes can tip into globular, and this would be a tough call at times for the Reeve, because sometimes it does open out almost in purely rounded bloom form. This is Liverpool Remembers with the strong color here, and as you can see from the way it is scrolling out there, it is some version of the high-centered bloom form. And something to note as I just move a few steps over to my left here is, as mentioned earlier, that high-centered bloom form, as we're going to see here on Rainbow Niagara, does not always open out to something that is still high-centered. It can become quite loose like this. Here is William Shakespeare 2000, and certainly not the high-centered bloom form. That's a little flatter across the top. I would call that the classic rosette, or am I imagining that I see a little bit of quartering in there? Interestingly, because petal counts can vary across the season, have a look at this one. Same rose, but blooming very differently, and I would be hard-pressed to describe that, at least at this stage, as having as many petals or having that same bloom form. Here's Lady Emma Hamilton, and we could probably call that nicely cupped, right? And this example of Lady of Shalott, very clear-cut globular bloom. Well, that's what I have for you on rose bloom forms. Please chime in the comments if you have any questions, discussion on the topic, or if you'd like to add some examples of your own.